Uh, Good morning or good afternoon. This is a really, really special roundtable. So as while people are logging on, I'm going to get started because I'm really excited about our guest. So welcome to a very special CRC Roundtable. We are celebrating the 50th episode of this monthly virtual seminar series. We started these webinars as a place to ask the clumsy questions, to practice bravery and humility, to have conversations, and we are so grateful for the community that you have built around them. If this is your first roundtable, all you need to know is that they are designed for contribution, not consumption. And as a reflection of that intent, our guest speaker has been given 25 to 30 minutes to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion, which we can facilitate out of the chat. Let me start, as we always do, by understanding why this topic at this time by this speaker. January is often a time of sense making, and it often takes the form of explaining events and diagnosing problems, which can be a retrospective process. But it can also take the form of formulating expectancies about future events. And this future-oriented aspect of sense making is called anticipatory thinking. We distinguish it from prediction because anticipatory thinking is functional. People are preparing themselves for future events, not simply predicting what might happen. Anticipatory thinking does not come easily to many of us. And one challenge is that it needs to include active attention management or focusing attention on the likely sources of critical information. And in this environment, that can be really, really hard to determine what's critical to help us with that. The gift of today's roundtable is that our speaker is uniquely qualified to help us with that. Paul Sappho is a self-described Silicon Valley futurist and technology forecaster. He asked that I give a haiku version of his bio. I've never been asked that before, and I've complied with his request. So here goes. LA born seer, future's path charted with care, Silicon sage leads. How'd I do, Paul?
You
So
did you did great. When I said haiku, I just meant make it short. I did not expect such an elegant introduction. Thank you. I'm very grateful.
So let's waste no more time in getting to our future. And so welcome, Paul. You have the screen.
Okay, great. Let me start sharing here. One sec. Uh, uh, there we go. Good. And just to check, you are now seeing one slide on the screen, correct?
Correct.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll get started here. Picking up on the theme of boundaries, what I want to do is fly low and fast over briefly what our present condition is, and also offer you a practical tool for thinking about how to meet large challenges. And I also have threaded in here some things that I think are worth looking at. There's an old saying that a consultant takes a year's worth of work and compresses it into 30 minutes, and a professor does the opposite. Even though I am allegedly a professor at Stanford, I'm going to do the former and fly very low and fast over a bunch of ideas, and I'll seed it with a couple of things to look up. One of them is on this slide. How many times have you heard the term wicked problem? How many of you have actually looked up the source and origin of it? I recommend going back to Wes Churchman. He was a Berkeley professor and defined it. And we live in an age of absolutely wicked problems. And so the tool I'm going to give you is a way of thinking about how to tackle wicked problems. I note that in a way this I'm talking from one bay to another. I live here in Silicon Valley on the San Francisco Bay, and it's a reminder that boundaries are productive zones. The Chesapeake being a boundary area is hugely productive, and of course, Silicon Valley being on the bay is the same thing. We're the world's 18th largest economy. And believe you me, a big part of why Silicon Valley is what it is and what the Valley has done has to do directly with the fact that we are on this complex knot of bay and mountains and everything else. And I know you have challenges, but boy, do we have challenges out here. One thing you all don't have to worry about on the Chesapeake is when we get the next big one, if we're very unlucky, it's going to collapse some 150-year-old dikes and levees and have a massive saltwater intrusion into our freshwater sources and the like. But I will push on here. The largest context, here's the last 150 years, how it all started. The Enlightenment, Romanticism, Realism, fin du siècle, modernity, globalization, the millennium, cyberspace. It's all been so hopeful. And Caspar Friedrich's picture of the wanderer above the clouds kind of catches that and those moments of optimism. Well, things have not turned out quite that way. To put it very bluntly, something very odd happened on the road to Marshall McLuhan's global village. We, in fact, have become multiple global villages interfingering across time and space, physically and cyberspace and like. And whenever I'm looking at rapid change, I want to pull back and say, what are the key contributors to this? Well, the biggest disruptor of all, the single critical disruptor, has been the arrival of exponential technologies. Moore's law, which is the pattern that drives the advances in computing and communications and the like. And we all know what that's like. What was very scarce and expensive and low performance becomes very, very cheap and very high performance. We all carry, we think we carry a smartphone, but in fact, what you're carrying is a supercomputer. So the next time you're with a friend in a bar and they complain that they accidentally dropped their smartphone into the sink, well, they actually just destroyed more computing power than existed in the entire world combined before 1990. And it's had radical, radical impacts. The solar photovoltaic phenomena is a function of exponential advances, and some things are advancing even more than computing. The Carlson curve is the curve of the cost of decoding a human genome. And way back in 2000, it was basically $1 billion. At current rates by 2035, it'll cost 3 cents to decode a human genome. And as a colleague of mine here in the Valley likes to say, 3 cents is a very interesting number because that's about what it costs to flush a toilet in the United States. So when decoding a human genome is that cheap, you can bet we're going to use it for all sorts of surprising ways. But to the matter at hand, the way I frame this is, quite simply put, exponential media is the solvent leaching the glue out of our institutions, out of our social interactions. And what we're ending up with is this very loosely connected, free-floating situation where all the rules are changing and nobody quite knows where they fit. And the result is, we started off with Friedrich's Wanderer Upon the Clouds. That's how it started. This is more like how it's going, a picture by Tyler Hicks back in 2001 of the Salang Pass in Afghanistan. And that notion of progress, progress is happening, but we live in a world in pieces. And, think back to Svante Arrhenius, 1896, who pointed out that a doubling of carbon dioxide might have interesting consequences. By the way, with full credit to Eunice Foote, who made the same observation about 40 years earlier. You would think that with a problem this serious and this obvious, that we would all reach agreement and the world would come together to solve the challenges. And in fact, as the headline from 2021 suggests, not so. And of course, more recently, it seems to be getting even worse. So what do we do for a solution? What I want to offer you is a tool, pace layer thinking. This was conceived of by my friend and colleague Stuart Brand, and mentioned first in a book, The Clock of the Long Now. I'm going to add some references at the end, but this is, I think, a really powerful diagnostic tool, and it's also a good tool for seeking answers. And the essence of pace layers is that everything that happens in the present is happening because of an intersection of different things moving at different speeds. And the top layer moves fast. Fashion is swift and changing. It used to be annual stuff. Now it's quarterly. Commerce is a little more slow, uh, quarterly, annually. Infrastructure is that thing which everybody wants and nobody wants to pay for, and it's probably got a 50-year time frame. Governance is slower yet. We're talking centuries and the like. We in the United States we seem to have a revolution about once every 100 years, and the like. So governance moves slower, and culture moves slower yet. And then at the bottom is nature, which moves in a slow, stately fashion, except perhaps in moments when it doesn't quite do so. So keep that in mind. The upper layers move more quickly than the lower layers. And the interesting part is the boundary condition between each. I'll show you a picture of Jupiter a little later, showing you the turbulence between layers of clouds on Jupiter. That turbulence between layers is where the action is at. As always, the action's at boundaries. Fast layers create productive turbulence. Think about what happened with the beatniks in the 1950s, Mary Quant, fashion designer, and the mini skirt and Twiggy and Woodstock. So what happens is the fast things create productive turbulence. They change our view of the world and the like, and the turbulence drifts downwards. And what happens at the fast levels begins to start affecting what happens at the lower levels. That fashion came down, it affected commerce and infrastructure. The personal computer, very much, its design was very much a reflection of the, individualism, freedom, and the like. And packet switching in the ARPANET, that's a picture of the first IMP, the first interface message processor in 1969. The design of the internet was very deeply influenced by the counterculture revolution, and frankly, it was built by a whole bunch of scientists who were some of them taking LSD. So culture, fashion at the top affects culture, it affects infrastructure, it affects the design of our artifacts. Now, I mentioned that different layers move at different speeds. And if they're moving at different speeds, that's how we get productive change and innovation. However, if they move too quickly, we end up with too much shear, then the speed differential becomes too great, and we get change that's more dramatic. This is how revolutions happen, is when one layer is moving so quickly that it's pulling shear from all the other layers. And that often can lead to revolutions. The inverse order. So I just said that the normal order is the top moves fast and the bottom moves more slowly. The inverse order is when a lower layer suddenly starts moving faster than an upper layer. And that's when you get deep surprise and the real possibility for non-productive turbulence. Take nature in the form of climate change, where thanks to factors up top, now we have a nature level that is moving very quickly. Well, when climate disrupts culture and then culture disrupts governance, this is the world you get. I've spent time in southern Mexico, I'm very familiar with the ejido system and how dependent pastoral farmers are on the regular arrival of the rains. And when the rains are disrupted, the crops fail. Then you get social disruption, starts affecting culture, gets into governance. You have drug gangs and the like. And the result is we have climate migrants. This is way back in 2018 on the Pan American Highway in Chiapas, Mexico, where I once lived, heading north because nature has moved so quickly. It's disrupting culture, and then that's disrupting governance, and you get the rest of the idea. I could put in a picture of the US border wall here as well, but it all goes back to something happening in nature very quickly. And when infrastructure disrupts commerce, then we get what we have today with cyberspace. This is a picture of Tim Berners-Lee, March 1989. He wrote a modest proposal for what would become the World Wide Web. 100 years from now, when historians look back at 1989 and say, what was the biggest event of that year? Another event happened, and that was the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I think 100 years from now, that will be a footnote, and everyone will say, Sir Tim's memo at CERN is what really created deep, lasting, unpredictable change in the world. So keep that in mind. Normal order, top layers move fast, lower layers move more slowly. Inverse order is deep unpredictability when a lower layer moves more quickly. Because, of course, we only notice things that change. And if something down at the bottom is not changing much, we're not going to pay any attention to it until we get caught by surprise. Another aspect of this is upper layers get all the attention. Fashion and, lots of change, lots of surprise. And people tend to not pay attention to the lower layers. But the fact is that if you're trying to solve a problem, lower layers have enormous power. So upper layers get the attention, but lower layers have enormous power. An example, this is a picture of Notre Dame burning in April 2019, and a shocked France watched this. And as Thomas Lacour said, it was like watching the burning of the Library of Alexandria. And what happened? This cathedral that took over a century to build and had survived for centuries. And everybody thought, how can we possibly ever rebuild this? We no longer have the technology to do this kind of work with wood. Well, it turns out what was originally built in a century was rebuilt in 6 years by France. Lower layers, it turns out, can be very stabilizing sources of power and renewal. And the lower layer here that rebuilt Notre Dame was culture. That even though the percentage of French who are Catholic today is a fraction of what it was in the past, Notre Dame has gone from being a religious symbol to a cultural symbol. And there was huge agreement. Yes, we must rebuild this, and we must rebuild it as it was, and the like. They did it in 6 years. Key lesson here in Notre Dame is social cohesion is critical to meeting the challenges of wicked problems. And Ibn Khaldun, in his work, the Muqaddimah, which, he's basically the father of social sciences, he pointed this out and he said, Asabiya, social cohesion is the secret to effective change when you have rapid turbulence between layers and the like. If you're not familiar with Ibn Khaldun's work, I suggest you take a look at it. His essential notion was that he had studied the patterns along the coast of what is now Tunisia and Morocco, and he noticed that in the conflicts between groups, that seemingly weaker groups would prevail over stronger ones. And the reason why was the seemingly weaker groups, in terms of resources, had deeper social cohesion. The culture with the strongest social cohesion wins. Now, just to summarize the dynamics of pace layers, fast layers versus slow layers. Fast layers learn. You try something, doesn't work, you try again. Slow layers remember. You think about fashion. I'm old enough to remember the fashion of the 1980s. And and I've noticed lately some of it's coming back. Well, thank God some people remember that 1980s fashion was a really bad idea and we shouldn't do it again. Fast layers propose, slow layers dispose. Hey, this is a great idea, says the fast layer. Slow layer says, yeah, no, there's good reason not to do that. Fast layers absorb shocks. Slow layers integrate shocks, and I'm going to come back to that one in a second. Fast layers tend to be discontinuous. Slow layers tend to be smooth and laminar, except sometimes when they're not. Fast layers innovate, slow layers constrain. About the absorbing shocks, the upper layers are like fire trucks. This is a subject very close to my mind at the moment. We're having wildfires in California. I happen to live on a canyon less than 2 miles from the San Andreas Fault in the highest fire danger zone in the state. So I'm acutely aware. Fire trucks are the fast layers. They got to get there within 5 minutes and solve the problem. Lower layers are the planners, the architects, the engineers, the scientists. They're the ones who say, how can we avoid the crisis to begin with? So if you're trying to solve something quickly, if you got to go lights and sirens, pick a fast layer. Do something with fashion. If you want to make change that's lasting, go down deep into infrastructure or governance or the like. And of course, any solution crossing boundaries has to be a mixture of fast and slow. Now, I'm from Silicon Valley, so let me say a word about innovation. Innovation is a conversation across layers. I'll give you an example of Henry Ford and the creation of the automobile. 1896 was the Ford quadricycle. It was running on ethanol. We didn't get gasoline until 1908. And at the time, there was a conversation saying, no, no, no. Edison said it should be electric. So everybody's saying, okay, we know we're going to have a horseless carriage. What's going to power it? Well, Henry Ford chose ethanol because he knew that so-called rock oil was better. But at the time, in 1896, it was scarce and it was expensive. Edwin Drake had done the first oil well in 1859 in Titusville, and it was a much more energy dense solution, but they didn't have enough of it to run cars. So they used the next best alternative, ethanol. What they didn't know was the debate over what to use was actually solved much earlier. It was solved in the mid-Jurassic, but it wasn't until 1901, Spindletop, Texas, and the Lucas Gusher that the oil price plummeted to 3 cents a barrel, and Henry Ford pivoted. He said, "We're going to do gasoline and forget electric and all that." And that's how an event 200 million years earlier is what really determined the automobile culture of the 21st century. Key issue to think about. The fastest innovations are often profoundly shaped by the deepest layers. And to paraphrase another Texan, I'm the decider, that it was decided in the Jurassic, and it just took us a little time to figure that out. Effective innovation happens at the boundaries between layers. If you want to make change, you look for that turbulence. And this is something that we see in bays and estuaries. The most productive zones, of course, are the intersection of water and air and land. So one case, I don't have time to go into depth. What a coincidence that the first microprocessor came out just as our first astronauts landed on the moon in 1969. It was because of the productive interference between layers, the Cold War, the race to the moon, and the need to get to the moon. It turned out we needed solid state electronics. Again, no time to go into depth on it, but this is where innovation happens. Innovation comes out of productive conflict between layers. As I said, any marine biologist will tell you turbulent boundaries are productive zones. This is a picture of Jupiter. That's the great red spot with a couple of smaller storms in there. The technical term for this is, I'm sure there are some atmospheric scientists in the room. They'll know what a Kelvin-Helmholtz instability is. The
Paul, I can't hear you. I don't know if anyone else is having that problem.
How about now?
Yes, thank
Good.
you.
Sorry, it's a little button on. Okay, where did I go silent?
I think about 30 seconds.
Okay, good.
Okay, good.
Good. So anyway, this is actually a good symbol for Silicon Valley that the turbulence of Moore's law and the like has created this sustained instability. And each one of those little whorls are new startup companies, and the big ones, the white one there is Apple, and another is Microsoft and the like. Turbulence is a really good thing, trust me. So let me close up here with some pointers on tools and solutions. I'm sure many of you follow Tom Gauld in New Scientist. He put it very nicely. Yes, we have rejected the great man theory of history in favor of a more scientific assessment of underlying causes. Um, he's got a point, though I think that we discover that the relationship between systems theory and individuals is that systemic change creates an opportunity that at moments a single individual can have an outsized impact. Principles for boundary solvers. Think long, think deep, think across the layer boundaries. That's how to make effective change. And one other pointer to practical advice, we do not pay enough attention to systems theory these days. So recall Donella Meadows, the Club of Rome report, and the like. The way to take a framing of change across layers and looking for solutions is as to use Donella Meadows' notion of leverage points. Look for leverage points. These are places within a complex system, a corporation, an economy, a living body, a city, an ecosystem, where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. I'll give you a pointer to Donella's article that goes into depth on this. Her paper on leverage points, in my opinion, is a perfect way to say, okay, let's go down the list of her leverage points and look for the one that's relevant to us. And just a closing thought, the most important thing in all of this is being explicit about time and time frames. Uh, Fire trucks, upper layers, fast solution, lasting solutions, deeper layers. And I want to close with a story that was first told by Gregory Bateson. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, let me go over it. And it's a story about New College at Oxford, founded in 1379. And any of you who've spent time at Oxford or Cambridge know that each of the colleges' greatest pride of place is in their great hall. This is the picture of New College, Oxford's hall. Um, and I should add, as a Cambridge grad, it pains me to give this Oxford example, but I tend to be ecumenical. Well, what happened is right around 1900, the Dons were at high table, and they began to notice that there was more than the usual amount of dust sifting down from the ceilings, and they thought, what's going on? And so they brought in a building surveyor, what the English call a building inspector, said, what's going on? And the inspector went up and he poked around, he came back down, he said, well, see those whacking great beams, these are 100-foot long beams, heritage oak and the like. They've gone to beetles and they're dry rot and they're going to need to be replaced. And the Dons started checking around and fussing, and they were at a loss of what to do because you couldn't go to the local lumber store and buy beams like that. And as they're trying to figure it out, the college forester got word of their problem, and he visited the master's office, and he came to the master and he said, "Well, your trees are ready." And the master of New College said, "What do you mean my trees are ready?" He said, "Well, 300 years ago, when they built the Great Hall, um, they built it with the best available materials, which was oak. They obviously didn't have steel, and they knew that oak goes to beetles and dry rots. And so they planted a forest of trees. And so the trees would be ready when the beams were dry rot and needed to be replaced. And so they were planted, and the original forester told his successor, and each successor told their successor, don't cut down them trees, they's needed for the Great Hall. So, sir, your trees are ready. And I'll leave you with that thought. The other example, by the way, was with Notre Dame. But here's what to think about. As you're looking at wicked problems, as you're looking for solutions, what we all need to do while we're tackling the immediate and the urgent is take a little bit of time, 3% of your time, 2% of your time, to plant some acorns, that will grow into trees that will not be ready for hundreds of years, that they will grow into trees, the shade of which you will never sit under, but perhaps your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren will do so. And thank you for that. So let me finish with, these are the readings to explore, Stuart Brand's book, the original article on wicked problems, Donella Meadows' Leverage Points, and also I think a very important book that's been overlooked, Joe Tainter's 1988 book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. At this particular moment in time, I find these four especially enlightening and interesting. And on the specific one of wicked problems, my advice is whenever you hear a term slipping into popular culture and the like, it's always a good idea to go back and ask, where did that come from, and what does it actually mean? So let me turn off my slides. I'll stop screen sharing, and we can have a conversation.
Oh, thank you, Paul. I have a million questions. I've just reminded everyone, please, this is a really special opportunity to have access to Paul. And so enter your questions in the chat. Paul, I'm going to ask you one just to kick it off. And I'm especially interested, working on issues of the Bay and watershed, about that interaction between nature and culture. And when nature is moving so quickly, and you talked about that as maybe perhaps being when those lower layers are moving quickly, that it's non-productive turbulence. So how do you turn that into productive turbulence? And when that layer, nature, is moving so fast, what kind of approaches can you use to help the culture move quickly? I mean, that seems to be where a lot of NGOs operate. They try to change culture, right? As a response to nature. But do you have any thoughts about that particular interaction between nature and culture? Because that's an issue really for a lot of restoration programs.
Yeah, no, well, and it's interesting you mentioned it because we have a wicked problem that revealed itself here in the Bay Area in the last few weeks. To me, the short answer is you got to start locally. I also, I'll confess a bias when more and more I'm convinced that large dramatic solutions lead to large unintended consequences, and that all things being equal, it's better to find solutions that are small, that are gradual, that can be reversible, because dramatic changes, dramatic solutions appeal to our ego and the like, but I think they often create more problems than they solve. That of course is the definition of a wicked problem. But the example of the wicked problem happened here in the Bay Area. See, I'll hold this up. I think you can see this. This is the Point Reyes Light, the local newspaper at Point Reyes. They've devoted an entire issue to the very difficult problem of whether to remove the traditional dairy farms off of the Point Reyes Peninsula or not. And I thought I kind of had an opinion about what the right solution was, which was, yeah, it's time for the dairy farms to go and give more of the range to the Tule elk. Well, after reading the articles in this paper, I no longer know what the answer is. And it goes right to what you were talking about, Denise, is first of all, I have to figure out what it is we're trying to do. Is in the specific case of Point Reyes, is it trying to preserve, restore a so-called wilderness? Well, pre-contact before the Spanish, it actually wasn't quite a wilderness. We all know that notion of wilderness is an incomplete idea that parts of the Bay Area out here, they weren't a wilderness, they were a garden cared for by Native Americans. So should Point Reyes be a wilderness? Did a wilderness ever exist? On the other hand, um, what's the role of Point Reyes as a preserver of culture? And are the dairy farms part of a human natural culture and the like? And very quickly you can disappear down the rabbit hole of this really complex tangle of issues. And so I'd say the first step, with any system is to step back and really be convinced that you've deeply understood what's going on before you make a change. And again, even though this happens to be current affairs, take a close look at what's happening in Point Reyes. Take a look at the article in the Point Reyes Light, because as a piece of analytics on solving a wicked problem, this little local newspaper has done better than anything I've read in Nature or New Scientist or the like in a while.
And how, I think what I'm sort of pulling out of that is that the interaction between nature and culture, between those layers, in the context of restoration, that you ask yourselves the question, what are you restoring to and for whom? Is that fair?
I think that's true. I mean, that's what I was saying. I don't think it's a complete answer, but we also have to acknowledge just how deeply dependent we are on the accidents of nature. I mean, I've done some long-range forecasts for involving cities in the Gulf and the Middle East, and one of the key issues is the rise in number of wet bulb days between now and 27. And I assume everyone is familiar with what a wet bulb day is, high temperature and high humidity. Turns out that that's something that humans are very badly adapted for. And that's because it turns out, we forget it, but we're an ice age species. You know,
Hmm.
humans evolved and occupied the planet because of the advantageous temperatures of the ice age. We do great adapting to cold with our cultural artifacts, clothing and the like. We don't do so well with temperatures because we sweat through our skin, and on a hot bulb day, sweat doesn't work. So it's also acknowledging just some of the some of the deep constants of the interaction between nature and the human species. I mean, we all know that climate change isn't bad news for the planet. The planet, it'll do just fine. It's just bad news for us as a species that happens to be dominant at the moment.
That's great. Here's a question I think you're just going to love by Dave Buzinski. It seems we're at the same point with AI now that we were with the internet 30 years ago. The internet was supposed to bring us together, but seems to have torn us apart. How do we prevent the same or worse with AI?
Yeah. I've been around for a while. The first AI company I worked for was the very first AI company in Silicon Valley in 1983. I've been closely following and deeply involved in AI, and in fact have to give a long talk about AI and its future later today. And I'm 4 days late on finishing an essay that I owe to someone else. I got good news and bad news. AI is way deeper change than the internet. Um, and way more disruptive, and we're going to do a really bad job with it. Um, so it's like, hang on to your seatbelts. This is going to be a wild ride. Um, Controlling AI, well, the horse is out of the barn. I think back to Einstein when he first heard about the first atomic explosion, and his quip was, "Now the idiot children have the matches." Well, now what we have is the idiot children have the something much, much, much more powerful than the atomic bomb. And quite unlike the atomic bomb, it's accessible to everyone and anyone. Uh, Back in 1945, we did not give atomic bombs to 15-year-old boys. Well, today, 15-year-old boys can play, and I'm not, forgive me for being sexist here. I know it's not responsible to imply that 15-year-old boys are not responsible, but I was one once, and actually they're not. Um, that we are about to hand this totally unfamiliar, unbelievably powerful tool to everybody. And it's not a future thing, it's already causing deep disruptions. So as a friend of mine, I'm a long-term optimist, but I'm a short-term pessimist. That I think we're in for a really hard time because of this. It was Tom Friedman who first used the phrase super empowered individuals. Well, AI doesn't just give super empowered individuals, it gets hyper empowered individuals.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I've been in the valley for decades. I've known AI for decades. I know how to write and Prolog and Lisp, and I am white knuckle scared.
Mm. Wow. Here's a great next question. It's from Elliot Campbell. Instances of humans prioritizing long-term benefits in decisions seems difficult and relatively rare in our current society. Do you have advice on how to incorporate systems thinking more effectively to address wicked systemic problems like climate change, biodiversity loss, and international equity? And I have to personally thank you for telling everyone about Donella Meadows' book. It is one of my favorites, that particular article. So,
Yeah.
um, how do we incorporate systemic?
Uh, well, I mean, we could have a long conversation, but the short answer is, the elephant on the table here is our economic system is conspires to reward short-term thinking and punish long-term thinking. One of the worst ideas of the last half of the 20th century was so-called shareholder value, which prioritized return to shareholders over, you know, what about community value? What about employee value? What about cultural value? Um, so right now, if I had to pick one area to change, we got to change the economic system. More specifically, we got to take the generally accepted accounting principles. And this is not an original idea by any stretch of the imagination. We need the problem today is the most important things in our life are what the accountants call off book. You can't put them into a balance sheet. Beauty, survivability, long-term environmental health. There's no way to account for those on an accounting balance sheet. Until we do, we're not going to be able to get people to effectively do that on a sustained basis. Um, Two thoughts. One, this is why I mentioned the Tainter's book, um, Collapse of Complex Societies, where he basically says, look, it's the marginal cost of doing something. Think about crime. When the marginal cost of being a criminal is lower than the marginal cost of trying to be a small business entrepreneur, guess what people will do? That's exactly what's happened in Mexico. Young young people take a look, 18, 20 years old, and they look around their community and say, what's where can I have a career? Well, it turns out the drug gangs are offering better careers than the shop owners. Someone to read on this regard would be Paul Hawken. He wrote a book, The Ecology of Commerce. He's written a lot. I'd say take a look at Paul. He's thought deeply about this issue.
Thank you. Um, Kathy, I'm going to call on you after I ask Erin's question, if that's okay. Um, Erin Ledovic says she likes your point about big changes and unintended consequences. When planning a change, monitoring the change, and planning for the consequences, are there models, examples, readings to brush up on to educate ourselves about putting on the brakes? That's a great question. In other words, is it a best practice to have an abort button, or does that imply that the plan will inevitably fail? So, how do you put on the brakes?
It's funny. So I have sitting on my shelf are sort of odds and ends of artifacts of different things. And one of the artifacts I have is this. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. It's it's a big red button that says fire on it. In fact, it says fire 3 times. This is the firing button for a piece of artillery that was designed to shoot tactical nukes. Uh, so I think about that as like, when do you push the fire button? I think the way to think about this is sometimes you have to move quickly, but especially if you have to move quickly, make sure that nothing you do cannot be tweaked or reversed. Don't make any irreversible steps if you possibly can. Sometimes you must, and you have no choice. And I think Gregory Bateson is a wonderful person to read in this regard. I forget if it was Bateson or wasn't Mellows. Anyway, the famous saying is the first rule about any sort of design is make sure you save all the parts. And so as we're doing all this, we want to be sure we've saved all the parts because we might need them.
Okay, Kathy, go ahead.
Oh, Denise, thank you for organizing such a fantastic roundtable and guest. And Paul, I so appreciate a very elegant kind of systems framework that resonated deeply with me. You reminded me of a geology professor I had back in college who emphasized you can't think about managing land use, water and land resources without understanding superficial landforms and how that drives our activities. And you can't understand superficial landforms without understanding the geological history of kind of that base layer. And then just to give a great example that my son actually just shared, a proud moment for me. He sent me a meme looking at um, the electoral outcomes in Alabama, and it showed the history of how the um, uh, geologic shorelines are where farmlands were concentrated during the 1800s, and where, of course, slavery was concentrated within Alabama. And it's just amazing to see how that's manifested in politics today across the state. So deeply appreciate, I think a lot of us don't even have an idea of what a systems framework is. And this was an amazing seminar in that regard. The challenge I have is how do we turn those insights, that theory, into kind of pragmatic guidance for how we can work together more effectively? How do we take that theory to help us inform priorities and think about tackling the challenges in front of us?
Uh, Uh, that is such a thoughtful question. And people always throw out, "Oh, great question." No, I really mean it. Your question not only was thoughtful, you actually answered your own question, and I don't think you realize it. First of all, I'll give you a reference so that the 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 South and the relationship between the line where plantations could be and not, and it was determined by the historic geomorphology. Roger Kennedy wrote a marvelous book where he talked about that. And Roger was former. He's no longer with us, but he was head of the National Park Service, and I'd look up his books on that. The other example historically of that was in the Midwest. It turns out liberal versus conservative historic communities, they followed the liberal communities were along the railroad lines, and the railroad lines, of course, followed the rivers. So, geomorphology really can be destiny in some sorts of ways. The answer to your question I think at the end of the day, I mean, I could give you all sorts of specific tools, but the simplest answer, if you want to create change, it comes down to stories. The, the, the person with the best story wins. And by best, I mean the most compelling story. And that we need to tell better stories. The most persuasive stories are the things that change people's minds. And when you change people's minds, they change their behavior. And the fact that you opened with the story of the South is why I say you intuitively know the answer to your own question.
Thanks, Kathy. That was great. You have any follow-up questions?
Oh, gosh, I would go down a rabbit hole, but I see the value of telling stories, but then I worry that communications and telling stories leaves out the need for remembering that communications is a two-way street. It's not a one-way conversation. And sometimes I worry that's what's limiting us is we don't come to the table kind of excited and looking forward to those two-way conversations rather than looking for like a magic bullet answer.
Good point.
But
Then taking that, let me rephrase it. It's not telling stories, it's sharing stories. And it's about the conversation.
Oh, thank you. There's another question from Meg Cole. And it goes back to the mentality of not taking irreversible steps. Does that limit the potential for effective dramatic change when needed? In other words, where does fear belong in this systems thinking and turbulent boundaries framework? That's such an interesting question. Where does fear belong?
Let me take the first part. In general, avoid whenever possible taking irreversible steps. On the other hand, there are times when there is no option. This is the so-called leap of faith. It is, crossing the Rubicon. It is Alexander's, the legend of cutting the Gordian knot. There are some times when one has no option but to do so, and you just hope and pray that you had the wisdom to make the right choice, is what I would say. But this is also time frame. So think about it this way. It's an example I use a lot with students. You're out on a sailboat and there's an island way off on the horizon, and you don't want to hit the island. But everybody's having a great time and sipping champagne and stuff. And suddenly someone looks up and they realize they're 100 yards off the shore of the island and the reefs are approaching. And everybody gets up and scrambles. The skipper shouts out, hard to larboard. The sails luff and turn over. The boat turns 90 degrees and they just clear the reef and they're back in open ocean. And everybody goes, shoo, boy, that was close. Thank you for that dramatic saving. Well, the problem was if they had decided to change course when they were 2 miles away from the island, it would have been the tiniest of course changes, and it wouldn't have even spilled so much as a drop of champagne. So oftentimes when it's time for dramatic change, it means who was not paying attention 2, 5, 10 years earlier. That whenever I see a dramatic change, I ask myself, who screwed up?
Wow.
I mean, think about climate change. If we had taken it seriously, well, it's unfair to say to take it seriously when Svante Arrhenius pointed it out, but, think about Charles Keeling and the Keeling curve that we've known since the 1950s is real. That if we had tackled climate change seriously a couple of decades ago, we could have done a very clean adaptation. We had a broad palette of choices. And now we're there. This is landing on top of us. And what just happened in the last 24 hours? The United States is withdrawing from the climate agreements, or trying to. this is suicide.
Hmm. I, boy, that message about who is not paying attention is pretty revelatory. I have one last question that's in the chat. They've been great questions. Thank you, community. I've read that loss motivation is stronger than gain motivation. This is from Ellen Kobler. I wonder how climate change messaging can focus on loss motivation without fear mongering in a way that the people just tune it out. So is there a connection to the type of motivation you can utilize?
Well, that is a really important issue that's raised as economists and your financial advisors will all point this out that we feel more pain from a small financial loss than pleasure from a small financial win. And it's why a lot of people make very bad investment decisions. Um, and I think that's true about all sorts of things in life. Restate the latter part of the question about climate specifically. I want to make sure I understand it.
How climate change messaging can focus on loss motivation without fear mongering.
Ah, yeah, I'm trying to think. It's that the big problem, and this has been, again, I mentioned Paul Hawken earlier. He's the first person I recall saying the biggest problem with the environmental movement in general and climate change in particular is everybody was talking about doom and gloom and what was going away, not what was possible.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know what the answer is with climate change right now because we're so deep into this problem that the losses are unavoidable, and also because of confirmation bias, the fact is we're seeing the very real consequences of climate change today, and people are denying it more fervently than ever. Um, so now I'm going to venture a little bit into politics here. I, I please do not mistake this for politics. I'm a long range forecaster and I look at long-term trends. There are some very wacky ideas coming up. There's um, very out in the fringe. There was a scientist at Douglas Aircraft in the mid 1960s who wrote a rather crazy report about how the world is reborn every 6,500 years and the like. And you can look it up. It all got tangled up. Suddenly, I noticed it's coming back into the zeitgeist that a very prominent talk show host was talking about it. And I started digging in, and what's going on, it looks like, is there are some folks who are saying if we can start the story about that the earth destroys itself every 6,500 years and that this is all in God's plan and that all this climate change stuff, this is all God's plan and it's absolutely natural and there's nothing we can do about it. That what we're seeing is there's some folks who are trying to spread a story of don't bother trying to fix climate change, it's inevitable. And that scares the living daylights out of me.
Yeah.
Um, so we look for the weird stuff out at the edges. That may have the biggest impact because, boy, if someone starts a story saying that there's nothing we can do about climate change, and there are parties that will get very rich off of climate change, and if the money interests suddenly have their fingers around the throat of this issue and say, no, 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 we're going to get rich on carbon credits and the like, then we're really in deep trouble.
Mm.
And I did not mean to end on such a negative note. I really am an optimist. As I said, I'm a short-term pessimist. If you look at history, the world's been going to hell for as long as anyone can remember. But in general, life has gotten better. I feel like we're passing through a very dangerous period here, but on the other side, there is a sunny upland.
Well, I can't thank you enough. This was an extraordinary, especially for our 50th one. You made it just extra special and extraordinary. You gave us a framework, and I can't imagine anything more useful. And so, thank you so very much. And thanks for the very good questions in the chat. It really proved to be a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.